Hello, as once again we return to normal. Thank you for being here. This is your host, Alex Hamo. Today I am going to talk about two things. The first of which is dissociation, and the second of which is numbness. These two things, I think, are integral parts of the experience of, the coping, I should say. One of the most common ways of coping with both depression and anxiety, and I should say trauma and various other kinds of distress. Now, they are very helpful ways I have found in my own personal experience. These are two very helpful ways of dealing with complicated feelings. But as many of you will know who have experienced dissociation firsthand or who have witnessed it in a friend or a parent or a loved one, dissociation and numbness, they often instill in a person a particular pattern of avoidance, avoiding confronting things. And there are various theories, various explanations of attachment styles, anxious avoidance. There are various ways of explaining what happens when a person is dissociating or kind of has the appearance of being numb or disengaged or kind of detached, aloof. There are many different ways of describing this particular disposition. And something that's very interesting is that for some people it almost seems like a character type rather than a kind of temporary state of being, rather than being dissociated just when one is feeling anxiety. And even if that is the case, very many people experience anxiety, very serious anxiety, nearly all of the time. There have been periods in my life where I have felt anxiety nearly all of the time. And for the people around me, it has been very difficult to engage with me, because when I have felt this way, I have been told that it's almost as if I'm not there. Sometimes I have had that response to anxiety, dissociation, numbness, avoidance, but then I've also had, kind of fixation and hyper-awareness and hyper-attentiveness. But that's for another episode. So, you may have heard of a certain Canadian physician called Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate, and he has done the rounds on social media. He, by all accounts, is a very respectful and patient and caring doctor and parent, although he admits that he was not always that way and was very avoidant, avoiding his family, focusing too heavily on his career, and so on. Now, Dr. Gabor Mate speaks about the relationship between ADHD, trauma, dissociation, and numbness. And in his eyes, he traces a lot of this back. He traces the emergence of ADHD in particular back to a particular family dynamic where you have a child who, for whatever reason, is being neglected by one of their parents or both of their parents. And what's interesting is that Gabor Mate speaks about neglect in a way that is very unusual. And what he does is that he describes what seems to be, now I'm not a parent yet, not anytime soon, but Gabor Mate describes a particular kind of parenting protocol where you have the parent who notices the crying child and doesn't want to kind of consolidate or affirm this particular response. Doesn't want the child to keep crying, and so ignores the child, doesn't give them attention. And I suppose the thinking here is that by ignoring a child in this way, they will learn to deal with their emotions themselves, and they will not kind of become habituated into screaming and crying all the time. Now, Gabor Mate has a very interesting take on this particular situation, and he says that what this can do to a child is, rather than being taught that when something is wrong they can ask for help. Crying, I suppose, is a human being who hasn't learned how to speak as a baby. Crying is the way they ask for help. The person who is ignored when they are crying, either because their parents are too busy, they're at work, they're tired, or they have actively chosen not to respond to their child when they're crying. Dr. Mate says that a very common coping mechanism is to dissociate. And if you are a child who was ignored or who was not given sufficient attention when crying as a very young person, Dr. Mate thinks that it is very common to develop a coping strategy of dissociation, imagining a totally different world where there is no pain and no suffering, taking yourself someplace else. And he applies the same reasoning, this same kind of coping strategy of avoidance and numbness to difficult family dynamics. So if you're a young person and your parents are fighting, he explains that it's common for people to react because, as a small human being, 5, 6, 7 years old, you're kind of learning how to, trying to figure out what it means to be conscious. And so resolving parental conflict is obviously something that is extraordinarily difficult for a family counselor or a family therapist, relationship therapist to do, let alone a 5-year-old. And so again, Gabor Mate says that there's a tendency for young people who are kind of witnessing very difficult things, whether what they are witnessing is the fact that they are themselves being neglected, or they are witnessing an argument or a fight between their parents, or regular arguments, regular fights. And so the response becomes to take oneself out of that situation, because some things are too difficult to deal with. And when you don't have the language, your brain as a young person is obviously quite far from being fully developed. You don't have the communication skills, you don't have the confidence to confront these things head on. It would be impossible and extraordinarily uninformed to expect a child to be able to, confront very, very complicated emotional dynamics between adults, their parents. And so obviously the most natural thing for a child to do is to use their imagination. And we know that children, something that is so amazing about children is the vividness and the creativity which motivates their imagination. And so there is a habit forming here, right? Something difficult emerges, and the response is to envisage, to take oneself elsewhere. And I believe this is how I responded to, I suppose, very difficult things that happened during my upbringing. And I think now as an adult, I see this same habit of kind of being confronted with something that is very difficult, very emotionally challenging, and feeling nothing. And I think many of my friends have remarked how, I have done a bunch of public speaking over the years. I've done some public interviews, and something that many people have remarked to me is that, I seem very unaffected when public speaking. And now, I'm not trying to pathologize myself here, but, I often think about this. Why is it that, this very difficult thing, public speaking, very stressful, very anxiety inducing, a lot of this attention on you, why is it something that, I find many things to be extremely complicated, but not public speaking for whatever reason. It's not as if I've spent a lot of time reading how to, overcome the fear of being in the spectacle, speaking in front of an audience. And I think this is one instance where I've been able to apply the same dissociative skills to something very challenging in a positive way. So I think I feel comfortable in certain situations, for example, public speaking, because I am able to apply these same maladaptive. As a child, they may not be maladaptive, but as an adult, these maladaptive coping mechanisms, they can be applied to things in ways that are maladaptive, and I suppose whatever the opposite of maladaptive is, good adaptive, I'm not sure, well adjusted. And so that's something that's very interesting about this feeling of numbness and dissociation that we can have, that it is not only bad all the time, it can be very helpful. I'm at law school at the moment, and I've also noticed that during my exams, there's a very fine line between me being too dissociated such that I'm unable to focus on the exam, and me being too locked in such that I'm beholden to, whatever kind of scrimmage of neurotransmitters is happening inside my mind. And I find this to be a very interesting thing to be negotiating inside the exam hall. But yes, there is something in particular that I have spent several years trying to wrap my head around, and it is the relationship between masculinity and dissociation, or numbness. And now we know that, if you read Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, or if you read Stoic philosophy, in a very cursory way, right? So, if you just kind of if you extract in very broad strokes what is being encouraged by Stoic philosophy, and also if you kind of deploy the word Stoic in its kind of quotidian everyday use, you invoke images of a kind of emotionally kind of rock solid and kind of inflexible and, like externally kind of very emotionally robust man a lot of the time, who is kind of unwavering regardless of what is being presented to him. Many father figures in my life, many role models who I've aspired to be like, who I know on a personal level. I have seen this. I have seen this in my friends. I have seen this in myself. And I haven't seen this in, not to, generalize about, gender in this way, but I'm currently trying to rack my mind for, glimpses of this same kind of extraordinary coldness or emotional distance in women, the women in my life, and I can't. I'm at the moment I'm just thinking about my mum, and there is something very different about my mother's emotional affect compared to my father's, and I think a lot of that can be described in terms of dissociation. Now, I think both, myself, my mum, and my dad, I'm a product of their psychology and their the environment which they cultivated for me as a young person, and the environment they continue to cultivate for me. And so I notice my behaviors in them and vice versa. But there is a different kind of, distance, emotional distance that I have seen in both my parents. And, I guess what I'm realizing is that there is something, I think, very gendered about dissociation and numbness. And we often hear people talk about masking and the, for example, it's we now know that autism is something which is presents very differently in men and in women, and that a lot of the time the theory goes that women are much better at masking, and so I suppose what I am tentatively hypothesizing is that there is one of the expressions of masculinity in the West, the shape that it is in today, is this very, it's this productive but very socially difficult type of dissociation and numbness, where it becomes difficult to have an emotionally vulnerable moment with a man, and I think I can be like this. It takes a lot of conscious work for me to feel like very deeply connected to my own feelings. I think that as I said at the outset, at the beginning of the episode, once you learn to respond to difficult things by dissociating and by creating mental distance, creating a different environment in your mind which separates you from the difficult things that you are witnessing or feeling, it becomes difficult not to do that. It's very hard to change habits. It's very hard to change ways of coping with things. It's very hard to change your beliefs. It's very hard to change your attitudes. And the thing about dissociation is that I think it may get a bad rap. I'm not sure that it is maladaptive in the way that, in a universal way. For example, I spoke about, my own experience with public speaking before, and that's something that, if I am proud of, anything about myself, it is, my ability to speak. And I think that something that has been very helpful for me in, gaining confidence in my ability to speak is the kind of capacity to be partly dissociated. So not fully aware of, an audience in front of you, because you have to do that. I'm not sure it is cognitively possible to be aware that, you're speaking to hundreds of people and also speak in a way that makes sense. Because the more you become attuned to each person's idiosyncratic needs and so on, the more difficult it becomes to speak in a way that makes sense for everyone. And for me, some public speaking tips. Dissociation is the way to go. I think that's probably all I want to say about dissociation and numbness for now. I'll return to discussions about masculinity in future episodes. But thank you for listening or watching. This is obviously in podcast and YouTube format. If you like the show, like my podcast, share it with a friend, leave it a positive review, and please consider subscribing on Patreon, where I will be releasing subscriber-only episodes and also a bulletin. I'm currently working on the bulletin for next week, and that bulletin consists of 3 things: 1 thing to watch, 1 thing to listen to, and 1 thing to read. with my own thoughts and reflections on these various kinds of media. Thanks so much. Have a lovely day. I'll see you next Friday. Episodes come out Monday and Friday. Thank you. Bye-bye.